What happens when two living legends of martial arts step into a modern arena against a new generation? You won't believe what unfolds next. Subscribe, like, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. The city was alive with neon light as Steven Seagal stepped out of a black sedan, his tall frame moving with the same deliberate grace that had defined him for decades. Beside him, Frank Dux emerged, his eyes scanning the street with the quiet alertness of a man who had lived and breathed martial arts his entire life. Their handshake was brief but firm, an unspoken acknowledgement of years spent as friends, training partners, and collaborators. They had fought in different worlds, Steven with his mastery of Aikido and deep ties to Japanese tradition, Frank with his legendary background in ninjutsu, karate, and full-contact fighting. But their paths had often crossed, both in dojos and on movie sets. It had been years since they last met in person, but the bond between them hadn't faded. Tonight, they weren't here to fight. They were here to watch. The mixed martial arts arena they approached was a massive dome of glass and steel, glowing under the night sky. As they entered, the sounds of pounding bass and roaring crowds hit them like a wave. Inside, the air smelled of sweat, energy drinks, and popcorn. Huge LED screens flashed slow-motion replays of spinning kicks and flying knees, each move accompanied by bursts of pyrotechnics. Fans in jerseys waved banners with the faces of their favorite fighters, chanting names and booing rivals. Steven and Frank found their way to a VIP section near the edge of the arena floor. It had a perfect view of the cage in the center, where two fighters were circling each other under blinding spotlights. The opening minutes were a spectacle. The fighters threw wild strikes, taunted each other between blows, and shouted to the audience. When the round ended, instead of shaking hands, one fighter poured water on the other's corner mat, smirking as the crowd laughed. Frank leaned slightly toward Steven, his voice low. "This isn't what it used to be." Steven's eyes didn't leave the cage. "No, it's not about respect anymore. Just noise." The next fight was even more theatrical. The announcer introduced the combatants with exaggerated flair, listing social media followings and endorsement deals before mentioning their fight records. One fighter danced to the cage wearing sunglasses indoors, playing to the cameras, while the other flipped him off before the first punch. The crowd roared at the antics, but the two men in the VIP seats watched without a smile. They remembered when martial arts was less about flash and more about discipline, when you trained to master yourself before trying to master another. Between matches, promo videos played on the giant screens showing fighters hurling insults at press conferences, shoving each other during weigh-ins, and tossing drinks. The audience roared with approval at every outburst. Frank folded his arms, his jaw tightening. "They sell fights with trash talk now. We sold them with skill." Steven gave a slow nod. "We fought to prove something. To ourselves, to our art. Now it's just entertainment." A loud cheer erupted as the next bout began. Two heavily tattooed fighters stormed toward each other, throwing haymakers with no guard, looking for a quick knockout. There was no strategy, no patience, just a brawl. One landed a wild hook, sending the other stumbling. Instead of finishing cleanly, he turned to the crowd, shouting and pounding his chest, giving his opponent time to recover. Frank's eyes narrowed. "Arrogance," he muttered. Steven said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. By the end of the round, the loser was bleeding from the mouth, glaring as his opponent strutted around the cage with both arms raised. When the referee tried to guide him to his corner, the winner shoved him away and spat toward the VIP section, earning another roar from the stands. The disrespect was casual, almost routine. Stephen and Frank exchanged a glance, one that said more than words could. For the rest of the evening, the pattern repeated: flashy entrances, insults, mocking celebrations, and only flashes of real martial skill. Somewhere beneath the lights and noise, the essence of the art they had devoted their lives to was missing. Stephen leaned back in his seat, his hands resting calmly in his lap, but there was a weight in his eyes. Frank, too, sat quietly, but his fingers drummed slowly on the armrest. They had come to watch, but each fight chipped away at their patience. By the time the main event was announced, they had seen enough. The sport they remembered, rooted in restraint, respect, and inner discipline, was nowhere to be found. Instead, the cage had become a stage for egos, a place where the loudest voice, not the sharpest skill, drew the most attention. And yet, somewhere in that noise, something else stirred, a sense that this night wasn't over, that the two old friends had not been brought here by chance. Neither of them spoke, but as the crowd roared and the fighters prepared for the next match, both men knew that before the night ended, the arena would be reminded of what real martial arts looked like. The main event had just ended, and the arena buzzed with the lingering energy of the crowd. Some fans were filing out, others lingering in their seats, replaying the best moments of the night on their phones. In the cage, the winner stood on the fence, shouting into the cameras, holding 2 championship belts aloft. His opponent had already left, his face hidden under a towel. It was all noise, all performance. Steven Seagal and Frank Dux remained seated in the VIP section, their expressions unreadable. They had seen enough to confirm what they already suspected. This generation valued spectacle over skill. But they weren't prepared for what was about to happen next. A group of younger fighters, all part of a rising MMA team, spotted them from across the arena floor. Tall, muscular, and dressed in matching team jackets, they moved together like a pack, laughing and shoving each other as they pointed toward the 2 older men. One of them, a cocky heavyweight with a shaved head, cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted, "Hey, is that who I think it is? Steven Seagal and Frank Dux?" Several heads turned. Fans nearby began pulling out their phones, hoping to capture whatever was about to unfold. Another fighter, younger and leaner, grinned and called out, "Man, I thought you two retired decades ago. What are you doing here? Looking for an autograph session?" His friends laughed loudly. Frank's eyes locked on the group, calm but sharp. Stephen didn't move, didn't even blink. The heavy fighter took a step closer, pointing toward them. "You guys used to be the real deal, huh? Back in the VHS days?" Laughter erupted again, this time spreading to a few people in the seats behind them. The youngest of the group, full of swagger, leaned on the railing separating the VIP section from the arena floor. "Tell you what," he said, grinning wide, "why don't we see if the old machines still run? A little friendly test, unless you're afraid we might break you." The challenge hung in the air, and the crowd sensed it. Phones were raised higher, whispers spreading like wildfire through the rows. Security glanced toward the VIP area but hesitated, unsure if this was just harmless banter or something about to escalate. Frank slowly rose from his seat. He didn't say a word. His movement alone silenced a pocket of the crowd. Stephen followed a second later, unfolding his tall frame with a fluidity that defied his age. His eyes stayed on the fighters, his face expressionless. The heavy fighter smirked. "Oh, look at this. The legends are standing up. Maybe they've still got some fight in them after all." Frank stepped down from the VIP platform, crossing into the open area beside the cage. Stephen followed, hands still loose at his sides. They stopped just a few feet from the group of young fighters. The noise of the arena seemed to fade, replaced by a heavy, expectant quiet. "You want to test the old school?" Frank's voice was steady, carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. "Then understand what you're asking for." One of the younger men snorted. "We're asking to see if the stories are true, or if you two were just movie magic." Stephen's gaze shifted slowly from one fighter to the next. His tone was even, almost soft, but it cut through the space like a blade. "There is nothing in the movies that can save you from what you don't see coming." The tension thickened. More fans were leaning over railings now, trying to get a better view. Some began chanting, "Old school, old school." The younger fighters glanced at each other, their grins fading only slightly. The heavy fighter gestured toward the empty warm-up space beside the cage. "Right here, right now, no rules, just to see if the legends still breathe." Frank looked at Stephen. A small, knowing smile passed between them, one born from decades of training side by side, pushing each other, learning from each other's styles. They didn't need to talk. They were already in agreement. Stephen adjusted the cuffs of his jacket and handed it to a staff member who had appeared nearby, unsure whether to intervene. Frank rolled his shoulders once, loosening the muscles in his neck. They stepped forward into the space the younger fighters had indicated. The crowd sensed that this was no longer just posturing. This was going to happen. A ripple of silence moved outward from the edge of the arena floor. The heavy fighter cracked his knuckles. "Don't say we didn't warn you, old men." Frank's response was simple. "Don't say we didn't teach you." And with that, the space around them seemed to shrink. The crowd leaned in. The fighters shifted their stances. The air was electric. The test of the old school was about to begin. The air around the warm-up space felt heavy, like the seconds before a storm breaks. The younger fighters spread out in a loose semicircle, confidence still written on their faces, but a flicker of uncertainty already showing in their eyes. Steven Seagal and Frank Dux stood side by side, motionless, their breathing calm, their eyes fixed on their opponents. They didn't need to posture, didn't need to pace. Their presence alone commanded the space. The first to move was the cocky heavyweight. He lunged forward at Stephen, throwing a looping right hook meant to overwhelm with sheer power. Stephen's response was almost invisible. A shift of weight, a pivot of the hips, and his left hand rose just enough to catch the fighter's wrist. Using the man's own momentum, Stephen redirected him forward and down, guiding him into the ground with a smooth, controlled throw. The heavyweight hit the mat with a dull thud, eyes wide in shock. Stephen never looked down. He was already turning toward the next threat. Two of the younger men rushed Frank at once, one going high, the other low. The first threw a quick jab-cross combination aimed at Frank's head, while the second tried to shoot for his legs. Frank's feet moved in a tight pattern, slipping the punches while his hands deflected them with small, efficient motions. As the low attacker closed in, Frank dropped his weight, pivoted sharply, and drove his palm into the man's shoulder, knocking him off balance. In the same motion, he hooked the man's ankle with his own foot and sent him sprawling to the floor. The high attacker tried to press the advantage, but Frank's counter came lightning fast. A short, snapping strike with the ridge of his hand to the man's chest. It wasn't hard enough to injure, but it took the wind out of him instantly. The man staggered back, clutching his chest and gasping for breath. Another young fighter, seeing his teammates on the ground, circled behind Stephen, hoping to catch him unaware. Stephen didn't turn. He simply stepped to the side at the last possible moment, catching the attacker's arm as it swung toward him. A twist of the wrist, a bend at the elbow, and the man was suddenly kneeling, his face contorted in pain from the joint lock. Stephen guided him gently to the ground, then released him without a word. Frank was now facing two fighters at once, both trying to coordinate their attacks. They moved fast, but Frank's footwork was faster. He cut angles, keeping one opponent between himself and the other, forcing them to trip over each other's timing. A sudden front kick to the abdomen sent one fighter stumbling backward into the path of his teammate. Before they could recover, Frank slipped inside their reach, hooked one man's arm under his own, and rotated his body into a textbook shoulder throw, sending the fighter crashing onto the mat. The other tried to grab him from behind, but Frank bent his knees, shifted his hips, and flipped the man clean over his back, controlling the landing to avoid serious injury. The heavy fighter, who had attacked first, was back on his feet, angrier now, charging at Stephen with a roar. This time, he led with a feint, trying to fake high before swinging low for Stephen's ribs. Stephen let the punch come, absorbing the movement into his own center, then redirected it with a small circular motion of his hand. The fighter's own force carried him off balance, and Stephen used a gentle push to send him stumbling several steps forward. As the man turned in frustration, Stephen met him with a perfectly timed open-hand strike to the chest, a move so precise it stopped the heavyweight in his tracks. He froze for a heartbeat, then sank to one knee, clutching his sternum, his eyes wide in disbelief. One by one, the younger fighters found themselves grounded, gasping, or standing still with their hands raised in reluctant surrender. The speed, strength, and youth they had relied on meant nothing against the control, timing, and efficiency of the two veterans. Stephen's movements were minimal, almost lazy in appearance, but every motion was calculated. Frank's style was sharper, faster, each strike a lesson in accuracy and economy. Within minutes, the semicircle of young challengers had broken apart. Some stood catching their breath. Others sat on the mat, rubbing sore joints or nursing bruised pride. None were injured beyond recovery, but all looked stunned. The arrogance that had brought them forward was gone, replaced with something quieter: recognition. The crowd, which had been silent through most of the exchange, erupted into applause. It wasn't the wild cheer of a knockout. It was the deep, rolling sound of respect. People who had been laughing minutes before were now leaning forward, clapping slowly, their faces lit by something closer to awe than amusement. Stephen glanced at Frank. Frank gave a slight nod, and the two men stepped back from the center of the space. The younger fighters didn't move to attack again. Instead, they looked at each other, uncertain, before taking slow steps forward, not in aggression, but in acknowledgement. One of them, the youngest in the group, extended his hand toward Frank. "I didn't think you guys could still move like that," he admitted, his voice low but sincere. Frank shook his hand without hesitation. Another approached Stephen, bowing slightly before speaking. "Guess we had the wrong idea about the old school." Stephen met his eyes. "It's not about age. It's about understanding." The crowd continued to applaud as the veterans stood surrounded by the humbled fighters. The night had started as another display of arrogance and theatrics, but now, in this small corner of the arena, it had become something else entirely. And it wasn't over yet. Frank glanced at Stephen with the faintest grin. "One more for old time's sake?" Stephen's lips curved in the smallest of smiles. Why not? The two men stepped forward together, not toward the younger fighters this time, but toward each other. The real lesson was about to begin. The crowd's murmur settled into a deep, expectant quiet as Steven Seagal and Frank Dux faced each other. The younger fighters stepped back, forming a loose circle around them, their earlier cockiness replaced by genuine curiosity. This wasn't going to be a grudge match. Everyone in the room could feel it. This was something far more important. Steven stood with his hands loose at his sides, his posture relaxed, but his eyes locked on Frank's. Frank, slightly crouched, kept his weight balanced, ready to move in any direction. They had done this countless times before, on mats in private dojos and empty gyms after hours, sometimes just for the joy of testing each other's skills. But tonight, there was an unspoken purpose. They were going to show everyone here what old school really meant. Frank made the first move, sliding in with a probing jab to test distance. Steven shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, letting the strike pass by without making contact. Frank followed with a low kick aimed at Steven's lead leg, but Steven turned his foot out just enough to absorb and redirect the impact. No dramatic movements, no wasted energy, just efficiency. Steven responded with a sudden step forward, his hand slicing toward Frank's wrist. Frank countered immediately, twisting free and pivoting to the side, his own hand darting toward Steven's ribs. Steven's arm swept down, not blocking, but redirecting the strike's path away from his body. The exchange was fast, almost too fast for the untrained eye to follow, but each movement had a clear purpose. The circle of onlookers leaned closer. They expected heavy blows, powerful takedowns, but what they saw instead was precision, timing, and mutual respect. Frank's style was sharp and explosive, honed through the years of full-contact fighting and diverse disciplines. Steven's was fluid and controlled, built on decades of Aikido principles and real-world applications. Together, they moved like two musicians improvising in perfect sync. Frank feinted high and came low with a sweeping leg attack. Steven pivoted away, catching Frank's arm as he passed and using it to guide him into a gentle off-balance. Frank rolled through the motion, coming up on his feet instantly, grinning. "Still got it," he said under his breath. Steven gave a small nod. "Never lost it." They circled again, this time closing the distance faster. Frank pressed in with a combination. Jab, hook, low kick, each one clean and controlled. Steven absorbed, redirected, and stepped inside the arc of the last strike, placing his palm lightly on Frank's chest to halt his momentum. Frank responded with a quick wrist control and a twist, forcing Steven to adjust his stance. The shift brought them chest to chest, each with a potential counter in mind, but instead of escalating, they broke apart simultaneously, both smiling faintly. The crowd was silent now, entranced. Even the youngest fighters, who had earlier scoffed at the idea of old school, were watching with unblinking focus. This wasn't violence. This was mastery, a conversation without words, spoken entirely through movement. Frank suddenly changed the rhythm, rushing forward with a flying knee. Steven stepped to the side at the last moment, guiding Frank's landing into a turn, then sweeping his leg gently to take him to the mat. It wasn't a slam, just enough to establish control. Frank rolled free, sprang up, and came back in with a spinning back fist. Steven caught the wrist mid-motion, redirected the strike's path, and released. The exchanges continued for another minute, each man pushing the other just enough to bring out the best in his responses. When they finally stepped back, breathing steady but eyes bright, There was no need for a winner to be declared. Both had proven the same truth, that skill, discipline, and understanding far outweighed speed and ego. Stephen bowed first, a slow, deliberate gesture. Frank returned it without hesitation, the bow deeper, a mark of respect for decades of friendship and shared history. The younger fighters joined in, some bowing, others clapping, all recognizing that they had just witnessed something rare. The crowd's applause started softly, then grew, filling the space with a sound that wasn't born of adrenaline, but of reverence. People in the stands were on their feet. Security and staff stood still, watching. This wasn't just the end of a demonstration. It was a reminder of what martial arts was meant to be. Stephen stepped toward Frank and offered his hand. Frank shook it firmly, their eyes locking one last time. "Good to know," Frank said quietly, "that some things don't change." Stephen's reply was simple. "The art doesn't age, only the body does." With that, they turned together and began walking toward the exit. The crowd parted to let them through, the applause following them until they disappeared into the dimly lit hallway beyond the arena floor. Behind them, the younger fighters stood in thoughtful silence, the lesson settling deep. Old school wasn't gone. It had just been waiting for the right moment to remind the world it was still here. You've just witnessed a moment that will be talked about for years. What would you do in their place? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, subscribe, and like the video for more powerful stories.